Some women are born into power. Others marry it. Mary Godwin had built hers in the dark, brick by brick, while the world slept and her husband dreamed of empires he would never deserve. Rain hammered against her skin as she stood in the shadows of the Hamptons estate, designer heels sinking into wet gravel, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows at the life that should have been hers. Inside, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, Bruce Finch stood with his hand curved protectively around a belly that belonged to another woman. The gesture was tender, possessive, proud. Mary had seen that exact touch before, felt it against her own skin in a different lifetime when she still believed love and partnership were the same thing. She should have been devastated. Women in her position were supposed to crumble, to scream, to make scenes that would be whispered about in society circles for months. Instead, she felt the cold clarity that comes when a chess player finally sees the entire board and realizes they've been playing a different game than their opponent all along. The woman inside was Angela Clark, daughter of pharmaceutical fortunes and old money bloodlines. She wore diamonds that caught light like captured stars, her pregnancy elegant and deliberate, a merger of genetics and opportunity. Bruce's hand remained on her stomach as guests congratulated them, as champagne flowed, as everyone celebrated a union that made perfect sense to people who understood that some marriages were built on balance sheets rather than beating hearts. Mary turned away from the window, her breath visible in the October cold. She did not cry. Tears were for women who had lost something they still valued. The drive back to Manhattan passed in silence, broken only by rain against windshield and the rhythmic sweep of wipers clearing water that immediately returned. Mary's hands remained steady on the steering wheel of her old sedan, the car she'd kept when Bruce insisted they needed matching luxury vehicles for appearances. She had always preferred this car, the one she'd bought herself, the one that carried no debt to anyone. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't read. Her mother in London, probably, or her assistant at the company Bruce didn't know existed. The company he'd never known about despite sharing her bed for years, despite claiming to know her soul, despite promising partnership that turned out to mean she would orbit his ambitions while her own remained invisible. Godwin International, her name, her vision, her empire built in the margins of a marriage that consumed her days while her nights belonged to something greater. She had started with a single shipping container, a connection from her father's old manufacturing contacts, and an instinct for markets that others overlooked. While Bruce built presentations about disruption and innovation, Mary actually disrupted markets, actually innovated supply chains, actually built revenue that didn't depend on investor confidence or projected growth. She had kept it secret, not from shame, but from strategy. Her father had lost his textile business when a partner discovered its true value and orchestrated a takeover that left him with nothing but legal bills and betrayal. Mary learned early that power revealed was power vulnerable, that showing your cards meant giving others the opportunity to steal them. So she'd built in shadows, used her maiden name, operated through offshore structures and trusted managers, let Bruce take credit for intelligence she fed him through pillow talk. Let him network with connections she provided. Let him perform success while she constructed the real thing in spaces he never thought to look. The plan had been perfect. Wait until Godwin International reached valuations that would force him to recognize her as the superior strategist. Wait until the power differential was so vast he would have no choice but to see her as an equal. Wait until partnership became reality instead of performance. But then, her mother's heart had given out in London, and Mary had flown across an ocean because family required the kind of sacrifice that business did not. She'd promised herself it would only be a few weeks, that she would return and finally reveal everything, that Bruce would still be there waiting. She had been wrong about which part of her life would collapse first. The penthouse was dark when she arrived, The space she'd purchased under a shell corporation while still in London. Not the home she'd shared with Bruce, but something new, something hers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson, the view obscured now by rain and night. The darkness outside matching the darkness within. Mary set her purse on the marble counter, the leather portfolio she'd carried across the Atlantic still clutched in her other hand. Inside were documents that proved everything. Financial statements, growth projections, client contracts. The architecture of an empire that dwarfed Bruce's venture capital fever dreams. She'd planned to hand him this portfolio with the kind of dramatic reveal that would redefine their marriage. "Surprise, darling. I built this for us. I can save everything. I've always been saving everything." The naivety of it struck her now with physical force. She had believed that proving her worth would make him value her, that demonstrating her power would make him respect her, that silence had been sacrifice rather than what it actually was. Erasure. Her phone rang. Bruce's name appeared on the screen. The same photo from their honeymoon in Santorini, when she'd still believed white dresses and promises meant something permanent. She let it ring until voicemail claimed it, then watched as he immediately called again. On the third call, she answered. "Where are you?" His voice carried an edge of irritation, disguised as concern, the tone of a man whose evening had been interrupted by inconvenience. "I got a call that someone was at the Hamptons' house." "Was that you?" Mary looked at her reflection in the dark window, a ghost of a woman who'd spent years being someone else's shadow. "Yes. Why didn't you come inside? Angela's family threw this dinner to celebrate the engagement, and you just stood outside in the rain. Do you understand how that looks? The engagement. Not his engagement, but the engagement. As if she were an observer to an event that didn't involve the dissolution of her marriage. As if she were a stranger commenting on news rather than the wife standing in the ruins." "How long?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the emotion he would expect. No tears, no hysteria, no feminine collapse. Just a question seeking data. Silence stretched between them, broken only by party noise in his background. Music and laughter, and the sound of people celebrating futures built on other people's graves. "Mary, I was going to tell you. I filed papers months ago, but your mother was sick, and then you had that surgery, and the timing was never right. I've been protecting you from this." "How long?" 2 years. He said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, like honesty delivered fast hurt, less than honesty delivered slow. "But it's not what you think. Angela and I, we have something different, something strategic. Her father's connections, the merger opportunities, the synergies between our companies. You don't have a company anymore." Mary heard herself say the words with perfect calm. "Finch Enterprises is failing. Has been for over a year. The only thing keeping you afloat is Clark money and the promise that Angela's pregnancy seals the deal." More silence. Then his voice changed, shifting from performative remorse to something sharper. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm not as blind as you needed me to be." She could almost hear him recalculating, reassessing, trying to determine what she knew and how she knew it. Bruce had always been brilliant at presentations and terrible at actual strategy, better at performing confidence than building substance. "Look, when you get back from London permanently, we'll sit down and discuss everything like adults. I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. You've been a good wife, Mary. You deserve—" She ended the call before he could finish telling her what she deserved. His opinion of her worth had stopped mattering somewhere between London and tonight. Somewhere between her mother's hospital bed and the moment she'd watched him claim another woman's body like territory he'd conquered. The portfolio sat on the counter where she'd placed it, containing proof of everything she'd built, everything she'd planned to offer him like a gift, like salvation, like evidence that she was more than the quiet wife who smiled at his business dinners and never asked difficult questions. Mary picked up the portfolio and walked to her new office, the one with walls of glass and a view of a city that belonged to people who took what they wanted, rather than waiting for permission to exist. She opened the portfolio and began reading through documents she'd memorized years ago. But this time she wasn't reading them as offerings to save Bruce's failing company. She was reading them as weapons. Outside, the rain continued to fall on a city full of people who thought they understood how power worked, who believed that volume equaled authority and visibility equaled strength. They were wrong. Power lived in the spaces between what people saw and what actually existed, in the empires built by women who'd learned that silence wasn't weakness, it was camouflage. And Mary Godwin was done hiding. Chapter 2: The Year of Shadows. London in autumn tasted like childhood and rain, and the particular melancholy that comes from returning to places that shaped you, before the world taught you who you'd have to become. Mary had fled Manhattan telling herself it was temporary, that her mother needed her, that a few weeks away would give Bruce time to come to his senses before she returned to reveal everything. She'd been lying to herself, with the same skill she'd used to lie to him about where her real ambitions lived. Her mother survived the surgery, but recovery stretched like taffy. Complications, bleeding into setbacks, bleeding into months that accumulated while Manhattan grew distant and Bruce's calls grew shorter. He claimed board meetings, investor pressures, product launches that consumed his every waking moment. Mary believed him because trust was the foundation she'd built their marriage on, even as that foundation cracked beneath her feet without her feeling the fractures. The call from the detective agency came on a Tuesday morning, while she sat in her childhood bedroom, watching rain-streaked windows that held memories of the girl she'd been before ambition taught her to hide her light. Her mother was napping downstairs, finally stable enough to be left alone for hours instead of minutes, and Mary had been reviewing financial reports from Godwin International when her phone displayed a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Finch? The woman's voice was professional, efficient, the tone of someone who delivered bad news for a living. This is Diane Fletcher. I'm an attorney specializing in corporate litigation. I need to speak with you about your husband's activities regarding your company, Godwin International. Mary's blood went cold in the way it does when you realize the disaster hasn't just arrived. It's been living in your house for months while you slept, unaware. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Diane's voice held no judgment, just facts delivered like surgical instruments. Your husband accessed your laptop before you left for London. He copied encrypted files. He knows about your company, Mrs. Finch, and he's been using your strategies to save his failing business while courting the daughter of a pharmaceutical fortune to fund what your intelligence couldn't fix. The room tilted slightly, reality rearranging itself into new and uglier configurations. How do you know this? Because one of your board members hired me when they noticed unusual activity in your corporate accounts. Someone was watching your company, Mrs. Finch. Someone with intimate knowledge of your security protocols and access to information they shouldn't have. We traced it back to your personal laptop, the one that went with you to London but was in Manhattan for weeks before you left. Mary remembered. She'd been packing, running between the penthouse and the airport, and had left her laptop on the kitchen counter while she gathered her mother's medications and made frantic calls to London hospitals. Bruce had been home that morning, claiming he needed to work remotely, his own laptop apparently at his office. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Why would she? He was her husband. Partners didn't spy on each other. Partners didn't steal. What exactly did he take? Her voice came out steady, despite everything inside her crystallizing into something sharp and dangerous. Client lists, supply chain strategies, financial projections, everything you've built over the past several years. And Mrs. Finch, he's been presenting your innovations as his own to potential investors. 3 of your proprietary import strategies are now being pitched by Finch Enterprises as original intellectual property. The Clark family pharmaceutical division has already implemented one of them. The betrayal hit her in waves, each one carrying different implications. He'd known about her empire for months and said nothing. He'd stolen from her while kissing her goodbye. He'd used her intelligence to win another woman's father's approval, to secure the merger that would save him, to build his future on her stolen foundation while planning to discard her like outdated equipment. "I need documentation," Mary said, her mind already shifting into the mode that had built an empire from nothing, the mode that turned rage into strategy. "Everything you have. Every access log, every stolen file, every presentation where he used my work. I have it ready. But Mrs. Finch, there's more. Your husband filed for divorce while you were recovering from surgery. He's been preparing this exit for months. And the woman he's with, Angela Clark, she's pregnant." Mary should have felt something. Shock, perhaps. Devastation. The kind of soap opera emotion that women were supposed to perform when their marriages exploded. Instead, she felt a clarity so pure it bordered on euphoric. Every strange phone call, every shortened conversation, every time Bruce had claimed he was too busy to visit London, even when she'd been in the hospital. It all made perfect sense now. He hadn't been protecting her from stress. He'd been protecting his plan. "Send me everything," Mary instructed, her voice carrying the authority that came naturally when she ran her company. The authority she'd always suppressed around Bruce because he needed to feel like the powerful one. "And I'll need you on retainer. This isn't a divorce, Ms. Fletcher. This is war." The months that followed were a masterclass in controlled destruction. Mary remained in London not to recover, but to build her attack with the kind of meticulous planning that empires required. She hired investigators who specialized in corporate espionage, attorneys who treated intellectual property theft like murder, and forensic accountants who could trace the fingerprints money left behind when it moved through systems designed to hide it. The evidence was overwhelming. Bruce had accessed her files repeatedly over several months, copying strategies she'd developed through years of grinding work and market analysis. He'd pitched these strategies to the Clark family as proof that Finch Enterprises possessed innovative thinking that justified their investment. He'd used her genius to seduce another woman's father into funding his mediocrity. But the investigation revealed something even more valuable than evidence of theft. It revealed that Bruce's company was hemorrhaging money faster than the Clark merger could save it, that his much-praised product launches were failing in markets he didn't understand, that his reputation for innovation was built entirely on presentations rather than results. He needed her. He'd always needed her. And now that he'd discarded her for someone whose last name carried more weight than her intelligence, he was discovering that pretty slides and confident speeches couldn't actually build sustainable operations. Mary's mother found her one evening in the study, surrounded by documents that detailed Bruce's systematic dismantling of their marriage, and sat down heavily in the chair across from her daughter. "When are you going back?" Her mother's voice was soft but steady, the voice that had guided Mary through childhood disappointments and adolescent heartbreaks and the particular pain of learning that the world punished women for the same ambition it rewarded in men. "Soon." Mary didn't look up from the contract she was reviewing, one that would shift Godwin International's corporate structure in ways that made it impossible for anyone to claim Marshall assets or shared property. "I have some things to finish here first." "You're planning something." It wasn't a question. "I'm planning everything." Mary finally met her mother's eyes, seeing in them the same steel that had helped her mother survive losing the family business, survive immigration to London, survive building a new life from ruins. "Bruce took from me. He stole my work, my trust, my years, and he thought I would never know, or if I did know, that I would be too destroyed to fight back." Her mother smiled then, the smile of a woman who had raised a daughter to be soft when necessary and ruthless when required. "Show him what we teach our daughters in this family. Show him that stealing from a woman who built an empire is the last mistake a man ever gets to make." Mary returned to Manhattan on a morning when the city was crystalline with cold, the kind of weather that made everything sharp-edged and unforgiving. She'd been gone for over a year, and the woman who stepped off the plane was not the woman who'd fled in tears and confusion. This woman wore her power like armor, her hair cut sharp, her clothes tailored to announce success rather than perform supportive spouse. She went directly to her new penthouse, the one Bruce didn't know she owned, and stood at the windows overlooking a city that belonged to people who took what they wanted. Her assistant had already filled the space with everything she needed: secure computers, encrypted phones, a team of professionals who understood that sometimes justice required precise and thorough destruction. Mary pulled out her phone and made the first call, to the attorney who would file papers that Bruce would never see coming. Then she made the second call, to a business journalist who specialized in exposing corporate fraud and would find the story of tech CEO stealing from his wife absolutely fascinating. But before she made the third call, the one to Bruce's largest client, to inform them they'd been working with stolen strategies, she allowed herself one moment of pure feeling. She looked at the city sprawling below her, at the empire she'd built in shadows, at the future she would build in light. And she smiled like a woman who'd just realized that the best revenge wasn't making him regret losing her. It was making him regret ever thinking she needed him in the first place. Chapter 3, The Calculated Return. The Hamptons estate looked different in daylight, less like a palace of stolen dreams and more like what it actually was: excessive wealth performing happiness for an audience that measured worth in square footage and coastal views. Mary drove past it without slowing, her destination not the scene of Bruce's celebration, but the law offices in downtown Manhattan where Diane Fletcher waited with documents that would detoxify a marriage that had been poisoning her for years. The elevator ride to the firm's floor felt longer than the flight from London, anticipation stretching time into something elastic and strange. When the doors opened, Diane stood waiting, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human betrayal and still managed to believe in justice. Mrs. Finch. She extended her hand, grip firm and professional. Or should I say Miss Godwin? Mary is fine. She followed Diane into a conference room where documents covered every surface, evidence organized with the precision of someone building a legal fortress. And yes, Godwin, I should have never taken his name. You can reclaim it. Diane gestured to a chair. In fact, that's the least of what you'll be reclaiming. Sit. What I'm about to show you will take some time to fully understand. The next hours passed in a blur of corporate espionage documentation, forensic analysis, and the particular satisfaction that comes from watching someone's crimes mapped out with mathematical precision. Bruce had been sloppy, arrogant in the way that people who underestimate their opponents always are. He'd left digital fingerprints everywhere, accessed her files without covering his tracks, presented her strategies at investor meetings without changing enough details to hide the theft. He pitched your Southeast Asian manufacturing optimization as his own innovation to Clark Pharmaceuticals. Diane tapped a presentation slide displayed on her laptop. Bruce's face frozen mid-speech, his expression confident and completely fraudulent. This strategy took you 3 years to develop, required relationships you built through personal travel and cultural understanding. He presented it as something he conceptualized over a weekend. Mary studied the slide, recognizing every word because she'd written them in her private files. The ones she'd thought were secure in her own home. Harrison Clark approved funding based on this? Partially, but there are 2 more of your strategies that sealed the deal. Your Brazilian import protocol and the African logistics framework. Bruce presented all 3 as proof that Finch Enterprises possessed innovative thinking that justified not just investment, but a complete merger between his company and Clark's pharmaceutical division. A merger built on my stolen work. Mary's voice was soft, deadly. What does that make the merger legally? Diane smiled then, the smile of a predator who'd just been given permission to hunt. Fraudulent, obtained through misrepresentation and theft of intellectual property. And Miss Godwin, intellectual property theft is not just a civil matter. Depending on the value of what was stolen, it can be criminal. And based on what Clark Pharmaceuticals has already implemented using your strategies, we're looking at damages in the hundreds of millions. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in Manhattan, Bruce was probably in a meeting, performing the confidence that came so easily when you'd convinced yourself that success stolen was the same as success earned. He had no idea that across the city, his soon-to-be ex-wife was systematically documenting every theft, every lie, every strategy he'd built on her foundation while preparing to kick that foundation out from under him. I want to file for divorce first, Mary decided, the plan forming with crystalline clarity. Public filing at his office during a board meeting. I want the Clark family representatives there when he's served. I want them to see him lose control, to start questioning what else he's lied about. Aggressive, Diane approved. I like it. But Mary, once we do this, there's no pulling back. Bruce will lawyer up, will try to paint you as bitter or vindictive. The press will be brutal. Society will take sides. Are you prepared for that? Mary thought about the woman who'd built an empire in secret, who'd sacrificed recognition for the fantasy of partnership, who'd stood in the rain watching her husband touch another woman's pregnant belly with the same tenderness he'd once used on her. That woman was dead. She died somewhere between London and here, between discovering his betrayal and deciding that mercy was for people who deserved it. Let them take sides, she said, voice carrying steel that hadn't been there before Bruce taught her the necessity of it. I have evidence, documentation, and the truth. What does Bruce have? Stolen slides and a pregnant heiress, whose father is about to discover he merged his pharmaceutical empire with a fraud. Diane began pulling papers from organized stacks, each one representing a different avenue of attack. Divorce papers, intellectual property theft lawsuit, cease and desist orders for every client Bruce had acquired using Mary's strategies, criminal complaint documentation for corporate espionage. It was a symphony of legal destruction, each instrument playing its part in the dismantling of a man who'd confused performance with substance. We'll file everything simultaneously, Diane explained, walking Mary through the timeline. Divorce papers served at his office in front of the board. The IP theft lawsuit filed the same day. Press release to business media immediately after. By the time Bruce understands what's happening, every major publication will be covering the story of the tech CEO who stole his wife's strategies to seduce another woman's father into a merger. And the Clark family? I've already prepared a separate communication for Harrison Clark personally. He's a man who built his empire on patents and proprietary formulations. He understands intellectual property protection better than anyone. When he discovers that the innovative strategies Bruce used to win his approval were actually stolen from Bruce's wife, a wife Bruce was betraying and divorcing at the same time he was pitching stolen work, Harrison will eviscerate him. Men like Clark don't tolerate being made to look foolish. Mary signed document after document, her signature steady and certain. Each signature was a small act of reclamation, taking back her name, her work, her future from a man who'd thought she would never fight back. Bruce had made the critical mistake that mediocre men always made when confronted with intelligent women. He'd assumed her silence meant she didn't know how to scream. He was about to learn the difference between silence and strategy. The serving happened on a Thursday morning, chosen specifically because Bruce had his weekly board meeting with Clark Pharmaceuticals representatives in attendance. Diane had arranged for a process server who specialized in high-profile cases, a woman who knew how to deliver papers with the kind of theatrical impact that ensured everyone in the room understood something significant had just occurred. Mary wasn't there to witness it, But Diane had arranged for one of her associates to be in the building to report back on Bruce's reaction. On the moment his carefully constructed world began its collapse. The call came while Mary was in her penthouse, standing at the windows overlooking the Hudson, holding a glass of wine she hadn't yet drunk. "It's done." Diane's voice carried satisfaction. He was mid-presentation when the server walked in. She handed him the divorce papers and the lawsuits simultaneously, announced in front of the entire board that he was being sued for intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. Bruce turned white, actually stumbled over his words. The Clark representatives immediately requested a recess to review the allegations. "And?" Mary prompted, heart beating faster despite her outward calm. "They're convening an emergency meeting of their legal team. Harrison Clark himself is flying in from Boston. Mary, they're taking this seriously. The merger might actually be in jeopardy." Mary closed her eyes, let herself feel the first wave of vindication wash over her. It wasn't triumph yet, just the beginning of justice, but it tasted sweeter than anything she'd experienced in years. "Bruce called me 17 times in the past hour," Diane continued. "I haven't answered. His attorneys reached out requesting immediate mediation. I told them we're not interested in settlement." "Good." Mary opened her eyes, looked out at the city that held her future. "Let him sit with it. Let him understand that this isn't a negotiation. This is consequences. He'll try to contact you directly," Diane warned. "Will you answer?" Mary thought about the last conversation they'd had, when he'd told her she deserved to be taken care of financially, spoken to her like she was a loyal employee being let go with a decent severance package. She thought about all the times she'd bitten her tongue when he mansplained concepts she'd mastered years before him, smiled through dinners where he held court while she played the role of supportive spouse, stayed silent while he built his reputation on intelligence she'd fed him without credit. "No," she decided, "I have nothing to say to him. The lawsuits will speak for me." That night, business media exploded with the story. Every major publication ran some version of the headline. Tech CEO sued for stealing wife's strategies to fund affair and merger. The narrative was irresistible, the angles numerous. Some framed it as a story about women's invisible labor finally demanding recognition. Others focused on the corporate espionage angle, the theft of intellectual property. A few mentioned the affair with Angela Clark almost as an afterthought, because the business betrayal was so much larger than the romantic one. Mary read the coverage in her darkened penthouse, her face illuminated by the blue light of her laptop screen, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt powerful, not because she'd destroyed Bruce, though that was coming. Not because she'd exposed his fraud, though the evidence was irrefutable. She felt powerful because for the first time in their entire marriage, she'd stopped performing the role. He'd needed her to play and started being exactly who she'd built herself to become, a woman who built empires and demolished the men who tried to steal them. Chapter 4. The Empire Strikes. Bruce's first mistake was thinking he could fix this with money. His second was thinking Mary would accept it. The settlement offer arrived through his attorneys exactly 3 days after the lawsuits were filed. $20 million. Full discretion agreements. Complete non-disclosure. In exchange, Mary would drop the intellectual property lawsuit, agree that the divorce was mutual and amicable, and sign away any claim to his future earnings or reputation. Diane read it aloud in her office while Mary listened, her expression unchanging as the numbers grew larger and the demands more insulting. "He's offering to buy your silence," Diane concluded. $20 million is substantial, but given what he stole from you, what he's already earned from your strategies, it's an insult dressed up as generosity. He thinks I need his money. Mary's voice was soft, almost wondering. "After everything, after building what I've built, he genuinely believes I'm doing this for financial settlement." Mary stood, walked to the window of Diane's corner office. Somewhere in this city, Bruce was probably congratulating himself on being generous, on offering enough money to make this messy situation disappear. He still didn't understand. Maybe he never would. Draft a response, Mary instructed, turning back to face Diane. Reject the offer and include a counter-proposal. I want a full forensic audit of every presentation, every pitch, every strategy document he's used since accessing my files. I want him to publicly acknowledge that the innovations he credited himself with were stolen from me. I want a public apology issued through business media. And I want him to understand that this was never about his money. He'll never agree to that, Diane said. But she was already reaching for her legal pad, already drafting the kind of response that would make Bruce's attorneys choke on their coffee. I know, but I want him to see it. I want him to understand that there are things his money can't buy, like my silence, like my forgiveness, like the ability to rewrite history into something he can stomach. The response was delivered that afternoon. Bruce's attorneys called Diane within the hour, voices tight with controlled anger. Your client is being unreasonable, they said, which was attorney speak for, we've never dealt with a woman who won't take the check and disappear. My client is being appropriate, Diane corrected. Your client stole intellectual property and committed corporate fraud. The offer he extended suggests he still doesn't grasp the severity of what he's done. Perhaps a judge will help clarify things. While Bruce's team scrambled to respond, Mary activated the second phase of her strategy. She began systematically contacting every major client that Finch Enterprises had acquired in the past 2 years. The ones won, using strategies Bruce had stolen from her files. This is Mary Godwin from Godwin International. I'm calling to inform you that the supply chain optimization strategy you're currently implementing was developed by my company and stolen by Bruce Finch. I'm prepared to offer you a direct partnership with the original architect of that strategy, with better terms and none of the legal complications that come from working with stolen intellectual property. Some clients remained loyal to Bruce. Others were pragmatic, understanding that working with stolen strategies exposed them to legal liability, that the woman who'd originally developed these strategies could probably develop better ones. Within a week, 5 of Bruce's largest accounts had quietly severed their relationships with Finch Enterprises and opened negotiations with Godwin International. The defection sent Finch's stock plummeting, investors panicking as they realized the company's recent success had been built on a foundation that was actively crumbling. But Mary's most surgical strike was reserved for Harrison Clark. Himself, she requested a meeting. Through formal channels, as one CEO to another, and to his credit, Harrison agreed. They met in his office at Clark Pharmaceuticals headquarters, a space designed to intimidate with its size and silence, its walls lined with patents that represented generations of medical innovation. Harrison was in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a man who'd built his empire through chemistry and ruthless protection of proprietary formulations. He studied Mary across his desk with the intensity of someone conducting an experiment, measuring reactions and drawing conclusions. You've caused quite a disruption, Miss Godwin. His voice carried the faint trace of old Boston money, the kind of accent that spoke of prep schools and legacy admissions. My legal team has spent the past week analyzing your allegations. They're compelling. They're accurate, Mary corrected. Bruce Finch stole 3 of my proprietary strategies and presented them as his own innovations to win your approval for the merger. Your company has already implemented one of them. You're now operating on stolen intellectual property, which exposes you to significant liability. So I understand. Harrison leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You could have approached this differently. Sued us directly, demanded licensing fees or damages. Instead, you went after Bruce. Why? Because this was never about your company, Mr. Clark. You were conned as much as I was. Bruce needed your money to save his failing enterprise and your daughter to secure the deal. He used my work to seduce you both into believing he was something he's not." Something shifted in Harrison's expression, a flicker of respect mixing with the cold calculation. "You're saying I made a bad acquisition?" "I'm saying you acquired a company that has no actual innovation of its own, whose recent success was entirely dependent on stolen strategies, whose CEO is currently facing multiple lawsuits that will consume resources and attention for years. Whether that's a bad acquisition is for you to determine." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Harrison Clark hadn't built a pharmaceutical empire by being sentimental or forgiving. He'd built it through precise assessment of value and ruthless elimination of anything that threatened his interests. "What do you want from me, Ms. Godwin?" "Nothing," Mary said simply. "I wanted you to know the truth. What you do with that truth is entirely your decision. But I thought you deserved to know that the man who's about to become the father of your grandchild built his courtship of your family on lies and theft." She stood, preparing to leave, when Harrison's voice stopped her. "Your strategies, the ones Bruce stole, they're remarkable. The Southeast Asian manufacturing optimization alone has saved us $40 million in operational costs over the past 6 months. Where did you learn to think like that?" Mary turned back, met his eyes directly. "I learned by building an empire while people underestimated me. I learned by being invisible long enough to see how systems actually work instead of how people perform them. I learned by being smarter than I was given credit for and patient enough to prove it when the time was right." Harrison nodded slowly. "Bruce mentioned you were his wife. He never mentioned you were brilliant." "No," Mary agreed. "He wouldn't have." She left Clark Pharmaceuticals, knowing that she'd just planted a seed that would grow into the kind of doubt that destroyed mergers from within. Harrison Clark was a man who valued intellectual property above almost everything else. Learning that his future son-in-law was a thief would fester in his mind, would make him question every presentation, every promise, every projection Bruce had made. The explosion came faster than even Mary had anticipated. Within days, Clark Pharmaceuticals announced they were conducting a comprehensive audit of their merger with Finch Enterprises, suspending all joint operations pending review. The announcement was corporate speak for "We've discovered fraud and are determining how bad the damage is." Bruce's stock went into freefall. Investors fled. Board members resigned. The tech press that had once praised his innovative thinking now questioned whether any of his ideas had ever been original. And Angela Clark, 7 months pregnant with his child, released a statement through her attorneys announcing that she was ending her engagement to Bruce Finch, claiming she had entered the relationship under false pretenses, that she'd been as deceived as everyone else about his character and capabilities. The statement was carefully crafted to protect Angela's reputation, to position her as another victim rather than a willing participant in Bruce's schemes. Whether that was true or performance didn't matter. What mattered was that in the span of 2 weeks, Bruce had lost his merger, his fiancée, his reputation, and any chance of rebuilding credibility in the industry he'd once dominated. Mary watched his systematic destruction from her penthouse, tracking each development like a general monitoring battlefield victories. She felt no guilt, no regret, no second thoughts about the devastation she'd orchestrated. Bruce had stolen from her. He'd betrayed her. He'd tried to erase her contributions while building his future on her foundation. And when she'd discovered the truth, he'd offered her money to be quiet about it, to let him continue performing success built on her stolen work. He'd given her no choice but to burn his world down, and standing in the ashes of his empire, Mary Godwin understood something fundamental about power that she'd spent years denying. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is become the villain in someone else's story, because being kind had gotten her nothing but theft and betrayal. Being ruthless had gotten her justice. Chapter 5. The unraveling. The trial became a spectacle that Manhattan's business community couldn't look away from, the kind of public destruction that people claimed to find distasteful, while consuming every leaked detail with hungry fascination. Bruce hired attorneys who specialized in defending the indefensible, men in suits that cost more than honesty, who spoke about misunderstandings and marital disputes as if theft could be rebranded into something more palatable. Mary sat in the courtroom every day of the proceedings, dressed in colors that photographed well, her presence a constant reminder that this was not abstract corporate litigation, but a wife reclaiming what her husband had stolen. The jury watched her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to respect to the particular fascination that came from seeing someone refuse to be quiet about their destruction. Bruce's attorneys tried painting her as vindictive, as a woman scorned who'd weaponized business disputes to punish her ex-husband for moving on. They suggested that in marriages, intellectual property became murky, that pillow talk about strategy was normal between spouses. Diane demolished their arguments with surgical precision. She presented digital forensics showing Bruce had accessed encrypted files without authorization, copying documents Mary had deliberately password protected. She showed timestamps proving he'd accessed these files, and within days presented identical strategies to Clark Pharmaceuticals as his own innovations. She brought in expert witnesses who testified that the strategies in question were highly specialized, requiring years of industry knowledge and relationship building. The most devastating moment came when Diane played a recording of Bruce's investor pitch to Harrison Clark. His voice confident as he explained the Southeast Asian manufacturing optimization that would revolutionize their supply chain, claiming he'd developed it through years of market analysis and personal travel. Then Diane presented Mary's dated document showing she'd traveled to 7 countries over 3 years, building those exact relationships. That every contact Bruce had mentioned in his pitch had been introduced to him by Mary. That the strategy he claimed as his innovation had been written in Mary's private files 2 years before he'd pitched it. Mr. Finch didn't just steal intellectual property. Diane told the jury during closing arguments. He stole 7 years of his wife's work, relationships she'd built through personal effort and cultural understanding, strategies she'd developed through intelligence he never possessed. And then, while preparing to divorce her for a wealthier woman, he used those stolen strategies to win the approval of that woman's father. This isn't business strategy. This is betrayal weaponized for profit. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict with a voice that carried no doubt, guilty on all counts of intellectual property theft, guilty of corporate espionage, guilty of fraud in the inducement of the Clark merger. The damages awarded were larger than even Diane had projected, $170 million, including punitive damages that reflected the jury's disgust at Bruce's systematic deception. Mary felt nothing as the verdict was read, except a quiet satisfaction that justice, when properly documented and precisely argued, actually existed. Bruce's face across the courtroom was pale, his attorneys already whispering frantically about appeals that would go nowhere because the evidence was irrefutable. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed with questions Mary didn't answer. She simply read a prepared statement that Diane had crafted. Today's verdict confirms what I've always known. Intelligence and innovation cannot be stolen without consequence. I hope this sends a message to anyone who believes they can build their success on someone else's uncredited work. The truth always surfaces eventually. The financial collapse of Bruce Finch happened with the speed that industries reserve for scandals too large to ignore. Finch Enterprises declared bankruptcy within a week, its assets liquidated to pay the judgment. Bruce's personal wealth, which had mostly existed on paper through stock options and projected valuations, evaporated under the weight of legal debts and the damages he owed Mary. The penthouse he'd shared with Angela was sold, The luxury vehicles repossessed, the country club memberships cancelled. Everything that had signaled his arrival in the upper echelons of Manhattan society vanished like it had never existed, revealing the truth beneath the performance. Bruce Finch had always been leveraged, had always been performing wealth rather than possessing it, had always been one major setback away from the mediocrity he'd spent years denying. Angela Clark gave birth to his son in a private hospital wing, but the birth certificate listed the father as unknown. Whether this was legal strategy or personal vindication didn't matter. The message was clear. Even the woman who'd participated in his betrayal had ultimately abandoned him when his utility expired. Mary heard about the birth through the same gossip channels that carried every other detail about Bruce's unraveling, and felt nothing except mild curiosity about how thoroughly he'd managed to destroy every relationship he'd ever claimed to value. The baby was innocent in all of this, but that child would grow up knowing his father as a cautionary tale rather than a success story. The most poetic justice came from Harrison Clark himself, who sued Bruce separately for fraud in the inducement of their merger, seeking the return of all funds invested in Finch Enterprises, plus damages for reputational harm. The pharmaceutical titan who'd been conned by his daughter's fiancé proved to be far more ruthless in his revenge than even Mary had been. Clark's lawsuit is overkill. Diane mentioned during one of their final meetings, reviewing the cascade of legal actions that had buried Bruce under mountains of debt he'd never escape. Bruce is already bankrupt. Harrison won't recover anything meaningful. It's not about recovery, Mary observed, understanding the psychology of men like Harrison Clark better than Diane did. It's about making sure that everyone in every boardroom knows what happens when you make Harrison Clark look foolish. Bruce will never work in this industry again, not just because of the bankruptcy, but because Clark will make sure his name is synonymous with fraud. You don't sound sympathetic. Should I be? Mary met Diane's eyes directly. Bruce destroyed our marriage while stealing my work to fund his affair. He tried to erase my contributions while building his future on my stolen foundation. He offered me money to stay quiet about it, thinking I'd accept payment to let him continue performing success he never earned. Why would I feel sympathy for a man who felt none for me? Diane nodded slowly. You're right. I just worry sometimes that revenge, even justified revenge, costs the person seeking it as much as the person receiving it. This wasn't revenge, Mary corrected. Revenge would have been emotional, impulsive, satisfying in the moment, but empty afterward. This was justice. Justice is precise, documented, and permanent. And unlike revenge, it doesn't require me to keep hating him to maintain its power. As autumn turned toward winter, Mary rebuilt Godwin International into something even larger than it had been before the lawsuits consumed her attention. The publicity from the trial, rather than damaging her reputation, had elevated it. Business publications ran profiles about her brilliant strategy development, her years of invisible work, her quiet competence that contrasted sharply with Bruce's loud incompetence. Clients who'd once worked with Finch Enterprises now came directly to her, apologetic about not recognizing her genius sooner, eager to work with the woman who'd developed the strategies they'd found so effective. Mary took the meetings, assessed which clients deserved second chances and which had been too complicit in Bruce's theft to warrant her energy. She was ruthless in her selections, generous with those who'd been genuinely deceived, unforgiving toward those who'd known the strategies felt stolen but hadn't cared enough to question their origins. Her company grew not just from reclaimed clients, but from new opportunities that emerged when powerful women finally saw someone refuse to stay silent about being undermined. She received offers for partnerships, speaking engagements, board positions on companies that wanted her strategic intelligence, and the credibility that came from having publicly fought for recognition of her work. Mary accepted some offers and declined others, always maintaining control of her narrative, always ensuring that her empire remained hers, rather than becoming diluted through associations that would drain her energy for minimal return. She was standing in her penthouse one evening, reviewing expansion proposals into markets she'd always planned to dominate, when her assistant buzzed with a message that Bruce had been trying to reach her through various intermediaries. "He wants to talk," her assistant said, voice carefully neutral. "Says it's important. Mary considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Tell whoever's asking that I have nothing to say to him. Not now, not ever. Bruce Finch is a closed chapter in a book I've already finished reading. Understood." A pause. "For what it's worth, watching you dismantle him was the most impressive strategic campaign I've ever witnessed. You should teach a course on it." Mary smiled at that, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Maybe someday. But right now, I'm too busy building things to spend time teaching others how to destroy them." After her assistant disconnected, Mary returned to the expansion proposals, her mind already calculating timelines and resource allocations. Bruce Finch had taken up enough of her energy over the past months. He'd stolen years of her life when they were married, and then stolen months more through the trial and its aftermath. She was done giving him her time. The city glittered below her windows, full of people building their own empires, fighting their own battles, learning their own lessons about trust and betrayal and the particular cost of underestimating the quiet ones who build their power in shadows. Mary Godwin had been one of those quiet ones, but standing in her penthouse overlooking Manhattan, financially secure and strategically positioned for continued dominance, she understood that she'd never actually been quiet. She'd been waiting, and now that her moment had arrived, now that her empire stood revealed and her enemies lay destroyed, she finally understood what power actually felt like when you stopped apologizing for possessing it. Chapter 6. The Rise of Equals. Kevin Cooper walked into Mary's life through a door marked business necessity, which was the only entrance she'd left unlocked after Bruce had taught her that romantic access led to theft and betrayal. They met at a conference in Chicago, where Mary was speaking on a panel about international supply chain innovation, her face now recognized in circles that had once ignored her. While crediting Bruce with her intelligence, she'd been answering a question about building relationships in emerging markets when she'd noticed him in the third row, paying attention with the intensity of someone actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to talk. He was tall, dark-skinned, well-dressed in a way that suggested success without performing it. And when the panel ended, he approached her with a directness she found refreshing after months of people treating her like fragile glass that might shatter if confronted with honest conversation. "Ms. Godwin," he extended his hand, grip firm and brief. "Kevin Cooper, Cooper Global Logistics. That analysis you gave about African port infrastructure was the most accurate assessment I've heard from someone who doesn't actually operate in those markets. How do you know what most consultants miss?" "I don't rely on consultants," Mary answered, intrigued, despite her instinct to keep every man at arm's length. "I go to places myself, talk to people who actually move freight, rather than people who write reports about moving freight. You learn more in one conversation with a dock supervisor than in 100 PowerPoint presentations." Kevin smiled then, genuine appreciation rather than the patronizing approval she'd grown to hate. "Exactly. I've been trying to explain that to my board for years. They keep hiring analysts who've never left Manhattan to tell me how to operate in Lagos." They'd stood in the conference hall talking for an hour, the conversation flowing with the ease that comes when two people speak the same professional language, when intelligence recognizes itself across the space between strangers. He told her about building Cooper Global from a single shipping route into an operation that controlled logistics across 12 countries. She told him about Godwin International's expansion into markets that others considered too difficult or too risky. Neither mentioned the trial, the scandal, the very public destruction of her ex-husband. Kevin treated her as a CEO worth his attention, not a wronged wife worthy of his sympathy, and the distinction made all the difference. "I have a proposal," Kevin said as the conference hall emptied around them. "Not business, not yet, but dinner tonight, actual food, not these conference appetizers that taste like cardboard and regret. I'd like to continue this conversation somewhere the lighting doesn't make everyone look ill." Mary's first instinct was refusal, walls slamming up with the force of self-preservation. But something in his expression stopped her, an openness that suggested he'd accept rejection without punishing her for it, without turning wounded pride into weapons. "Just dinner?" she asked, needing clarity before she agreed to anything that resembled vulnerability. "Just dinner," he confirmed. "Two people who understand logistics talking about something other than freight costs and container regulations. Unless you'd prefer to spend your evening at the hotel bar making small talk with people who'll pitch you their startups." She'd laughed at that, surprised by the sound coming from her own throat. "Fine, dinner, but I choose the restaurant." They'd gone to a small Italian place Mary knew from previous Chicago visits. The kind of establishment that served excellent food without trying to become an experience. Over wine and pasta, their conversation shifted from professional to personal in increments so small, Mary barely noticed the transition, until she realized she was telling him about growing up in London, about her father's textile business, and the lessons she'd learned watching it stolen from him. "That's why you built your company under your maiden name," Kevin observed. "Not a question, but an understanding. You learned early that showing people your full hand meant giving them the opportunity to take it." "Exactly." Mary was surprised he'd grasped the psychology so quickly. "Most people think I kept it secret because I was ashamed or hiding something. They don't understand that sometimes invisibility is strategy, not weakness." Kevin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I went through something similar when I was first building Cooper Global. My ex-fiancée, she wanted me to merge my company with her family's shipping business. Talked about synergy and partnership, but what she really wanted was to absorb what I'd built into her family's legacy. When I refused, she tried to sabotage my contracts, told my clients I was unreliable, used her family's reputation to damage mine." "What did you do?" Mary asked, leaning forward. "I documented everything and sued her family for tortious interference. Won a settlement that paid for my next 5 routes and taught me that keeping business and romance separate isn't cold. It's survival." They talked through 3 courses and a bottle of wine, the restaurant emptying around them as closing time approached. When Kevin walked her back to her hotel, he stopped at the entrance without assuming entry, without suggesting his room or hers, without performing any of the moves that men made when they thought conversation was foreplay. "I'd like to see you again," he said simply. "Not at a conference, not for business. Just to see you." Mary had looked at him. This man who'd shared his own story of betrayal without making it a competition with hers, who'd treated her intelligence as attractive rather than threatening, who'd asked for her time rather than assuming he'd earned access to it. "I'm not ready for anything complicated," she told him honestly. "The divorce was recent. The trial was brutal. I'm still learning how to trust my own judgment about people after being so wrong about the person I married." "Complicated is overrated anyway," Kevin said. "What if we start with simple? Dinner when we're in the same city? Conversations that don't require vulnerability you're not ready to give. No expectations, no pressure, just 2 people who enjoy talking to each other." "That's actually complicated," Mary pointed out. "Simple would be never seeing each other again." Kevin laughed. "Fair point. Okay, it's strategically complicated with clearly defined boundaries and exit clauses. Better." Despite herself, despite every wall she'd built, Mary smiled. "Better, fine, dinner when we're in the same city. But I'm not promising anything beyond that. Wouldn't ask you to." Kevin stepped back, giving her space. "Good night, Mary. This was the best conversation I've had in months. She'd watched him walk away, disappearing into the Chicago night, and felt something she'd thought Bruce had killed in her. Curiosity about where something might lead if she allowed it to develop naturally rather than forcing it into shapes that someone else required. Over the following months, Mary and Kevin developed a relationship that existed in hotel restaurants and conference center cafes. Conversations that ranged from professional strategy to personal philosophy, always ending with him respecting whatever boundaries she'd established that day. He never pushed for more than she offered, never weaponized her hesitation against her, never made her feel broken for being cautious. "You're not damaged," he told her one evening in Seattle, after she'd apologized for not being ready to let him kiss her goodnight, despite them having seen each other for months. "You're careful." There's a difference. Careful is intelligent. Careful is learning from experience. I'd rather be with someone who's careful than someone who gives trust without earning it. "You're being very patient," Mary observed, studying his face for signs of frustration or manipulation. "I'm being realistic," Kevin corrected. "You're brilliant, successful, and recovering from a betrayal that would make most people never trust again. If I pushed for more than you're ready to give, I'd be proving I'm exactly like the man who taught you not to trust. I'd rather wait until you're sure than rush you into something that will blow up because you weren't ready." It was the lack of pressure that ultimately dissolved her resistance. Kevin's patience wasn't the patience of manipulation, but the patience of someone who genuinely believed she was worth waiting for, who understood that trust was earned through consistency rather than demanded through charm. Their first kiss happened in Denver during a snowstorm that trapped them in the hotel where a trade conference had just concluded. They'd been talking in the lobby bar, the space nearly empty due to the weather, and the conversation had shifted to childhood winters, to memories that shaped who they'd become. "I used to build snowmen with my father," Mary said, surprised at herself for sharing something so vulnerable. "Every winter in London, even when there was barely enough snow, he'd help me construct these elaborate snow sculptures. He said building something beautiful from frozen water taught me that anything could become art if you approached it with the right combination of skill and vision." Kevin had looked at her then with an expression that made her breath catch. Not desire exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous, recognition. "My mother used to make me read the dictionary when I was young, not as punishment, but because she said words were power, and knowing their precise meanings would let me negotiate better deals than the people who just approximated language. She was a housekeeper, but she taught me to think like someone who owned the houses she cleaned. We're both children of people who taught us to see what others missed," Mary said softly. "Yeah." Kevin's hand reached across the small table between them, not grabbing but offering, palm up and waiting. "We are." Mary had looked at his hand for a long moment, considering everything that accepting it would mean, all the vulnerability that came with allowing someone past the fortress she'd built. Then she'd placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close gently around hers, and understood that sometimes trust wasn't about certainty, but about the willingness to risk uncertainty with someone who'd proven themselves worthy of the risk. The kiss that followed was soft and questioning, his lips on hers, asking permission rather than taking it, and Mary had leaned into it with the tentative hope of someone learning to believe that not every man was Bruce Finch, disguised behind better manners. When they pulled apart, Kevin had smiled.
"Was that okay?"
"It was terrifying," Mary admitted. "But yes, okay. Want to be terrified again sometime?" he asked, keeping it light, giving her room to retreat if she needed to. "Maybe." She squeezed his hand, still holding hers. "Ask me again when I've had time to process that being terrified didn't actually kill me." They'd sat in that hotel bar talking until dawn while the snow continued falling outside, building the foundation of something that felt less like falling in love and more like choosing partnership with clear eyes and careful consideration. It wasn't the romance of movies or novels. It was better than that. It was real. Chapter 7, The Courtship of Titans. Falling in love after betrayal was not the graceful descent that poetry promised, but rather a series of small jumps over chasms of doubt. Each leap requiring faith Mary had to rebuild brick by brick. Kevin understood this in ways that made her suspect he'd done his own rebuilding, that his patience came from having needed it himself once. Their relationship developed in the spaces between their separate empires, dinners in cities where their work overlapped, phone calls that stretched past midnight discussing everything from geopolitical trade policy to childhood wounds that shaped adult caution. He sent her books he thought she'd like, not flowers that would die within a week, and the thoughtfulness of his gifts told her he was paying attention in ways Bruce never had. "Why books?" she asked one evening, after he'd sent her a first edition of a novel she'd mentioned loving during a conversation weeks earlier. "Because flowers are about the person giving them," Kevin said. "They're a performance of romance, something to post on social media or display in an office. Books are about actually listening to what someone values. Plus, you strike me as someone who'd rather have something that lasts than something that wilts." He was right, of course, but his correctness scared her almost as much as it pleased her, because being understood meant being seen, and being seen meant being vulnerable to someone who could use that understanding against her. "You're doing it again," Kevin observed gently during a dinner in Boston, watching her expression close like shutters over windows, "pulling back right when things start feeling comfortable." "I don't know what you mean." But she did, and they both knew it. "Mary, I'm not him." Kevin set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "I know what Bruce did to you. Not just the theft and the affair, but the systematic way he made you doubt your own intelligence by taking credit for it. I know that kind of betrayal doesn't heal quickly, but at some point, you're going to have to decide whether you want to let one bad man determine how you relate to all men forever, or whether you're willing to risk trusting that not everyone is performing partnership while planning their exit. That's easy to say when you're not the one who spent years building something only to watch it get stolen by the person who promised to protect it." Her voice carried more heat than she intended. "You're right. It is easy to say." Kevin leaned back, not retreating but giving her space. "But here's what's not easy. Watching someone I care about stay trapped in fear, because healing requires more courage than building empires. You conquered international markets, Mary. You destroyed a man who tried to erase you. You rebuilt your reputation from ashes. But you won't let yourself be happy, because happiness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels too much like the thing that got you hurt last time." The truth of his words landed like fists, each one accurate and painful. Mary wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that caution wasn't cowardice. But deep down, she recognized what he was saying, because she'd been saying it to herself in the quiet moments when her walls felt less like protection and more like prison. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted finally. The confession costing her more than any business negotiation ever had. "I don't know how to let someone in without constantly calculating when they'll use that access to destroy me. Every time you're kind, I wait for the other shoe to drop. Every time you're patient, I wonder what you're really waiting for. And I hate that Bruce broke me badly enough that I can't accept good things at face value anymore." Kevin reached across the table, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and took her hand. "You're not broken, you're learning. And here's what I'm willing to offer: time. As much time as you need to believe that my kindness isn't strategy, that my patience isn't manipulation, that I actually want to be with you, not with what you've built or what you can give me, but with the woman who built an empire while everyone was looking the other way." Mary felt her eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall in a public restaurant. What if I'm never ready? What if the damage is permanent? Then we'll figure that out together. Kevin's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. But I don't think the damage is permanent. I think you're terrified of hoping again, because hope is what got crushed last time. But Mary, hope based on evidence is different than hope based on illusion. You have evidence now. Months of me showing up when I say I will, respecting boundaries when you set them, being honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. At some point, evidence has to matter more than fear. They'd left the restaurant walking close, but not touching, the autumn air in Boston carrying the smell of fallen leaves and approaching winter. At her hotel entrance, Kevin had stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious in the streetlight glow. I'm going to tell you something, and you don't have to respond tonight or even this month, but I need you to hear it. He took a breath. I'm falling in love with you, not with your company or your success story or your triumph over adversity. With you, the woman who overthinks everything and builds walls when she's scared and has opinions about port infrastructure that she'll defend like religious doctrine. That's who I'm falling in love with. And I'm willing to fall alone if that's what it takes for you to feel safe. But I wanted you to know that this isn't casual for me. It stopped being casual the moment you told me about your father's business getting stolen, and I saw in your eyes that you understood betrayal the same way I do. Mary stood frozen, Kevin's words rearranging everything she'd told herself about what was possible after Bruce. She'd convinced herself that the best she could hope for was pleasant companionship, that the deep trust required for actual partnership was beyond her now. But Kevin was offering her that trust while asking for nothing in return except the chance to keep offering it. I'm terrified, she whispered. I know. He smiled, sad and understanding. But you're also brave enough to have destroyed the man who stole from you in front of the entire business world. Maybe you're brave enough to let yourself be happy too. He'd kissed her forehead, gentle and brief, then walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the cold Boston night with the weight of his confession settling into spaces she'd thought were permanently closed. The breakthrough came weeks later in her penthouse in Manhattan, where Kevin had been invited for dinner for the first time since they'd met. Mary had cooked, a skill she'd let atrophy during her marriage because Bruce had preferred restaurants where being seen mattered more than what was eaten. Kevin had praised her pasta with the kind of specific appreciation that meant he was actually tasting it rather than performing gratitude. They'd moved to the living room after dinner, sitting on her stark white sofa with wine and conversation that flowed easily until Mary felt herself tensing, waiting for Kevin to make a move, to try to turn the evening into something she wasn't ready for. You're doing it again, Kevin said, watching her body language shift. Should I leave? No. Mary forced herself to relax, to articulate what she was feeling, rather than letting fear speak for her. I'm waiting for you to pressure me, to suggest staying over, or coming back to your place, or making this evening about sex rather than just time together. And because you haven't done any of that, I'm suspicious about why you haven't, and wondering if your patience is actually manipulation disguised as respect. Kevin set down his wine glass, his expression patient, but also tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Mary, I'm going to be very direct with you right now, and if it costs me this relationship, then at least you'll know the truth. I want you, physically, emotionally, in all the ways one person can want another. But I want you willing, not pressured. I want you eager, not dutiful. I want you to choose me, because being with me makes you happy, not because I wore you down or made you feel obligated. And if that never happens, if you decide that the damage from Bruce is too extensive and you'd rather be alone than risk trusting someone who might hurt you, then I'll be disappointed, but I'll understand. What I won't do is pressure you into vulnerability you're not ready for and then watch you hate yourself for giving in. The honesty of his statement, delivered without anger or ultimatum, broke something open in Mary that she'd been protecting since London. She'd been testing Kevin for months, watching for signs of Bruce's manipulations disguised behind better presentation. But Kevin kept refusing to play the game she'd learned, kept insisting on honesty, even when performance would have been easier. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I keep waiting for you to be him, to reveal that everything you've shown me has been strategy leading to some moment where you take what you want and leave me with nothing. But you keep just being yourself, and I don't know what to do with that." "You could try believing it," Kevin suggested. "Not blindly, not stupidly, but based on the evidence I've given you over months of consistent behavior. I'm not perfect, Mary. I'll disappoint you sometimes, mess up, say the wrong thing. But I'm not performing patience to get something from you. I'm being patient because you're worth the wait." Mary looked at him. This man who'd entered her life through professional overlap and stayed through genuine interest, who'd given her space and time and honesty when she'd expected pressure and demands and deception. She thought about Bruce, who'd stolen her work and her trust and years of her life. Then she thought about Kevin, who'd given her books and patience and the radical gift of being allowed to heal at her own pace. "I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted. The words terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "And it scares me more than anything I've ever done in business, because at least in business I can control outcomes through strategy and preparation. But this requires faith, and faith is what Bruce destroyed." Kevin moved closer on the couch, slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted. "Then let's rebuild your faith the same way you rebuilt your empire. One small decision at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. No giant leaps, just small steps that add up to something real." She'd kissed him then. A real kiss, not the tentative one from Denver, but something deeper, choosing to believe that not every man was Bruce Finch disguised behind patience. That trust could be rebuilt through consistent evidence rather than blind hope. When they pulled apart, Mary felt something she hadn't felt since before London. The possibility that happiness was available to her again if she was brave enough to reach for it. "Stay tonight," she said, "not because I'm ready for everything, but because I'm ready to start trying." Kevin smiled, real and warm and without the triumph that lesser men would have shown. "I can work with trying." They'd fallen asleep on her couch, talking about everything and nothing. Kevin's arm around her shoulders, Mary's head against his chest, both of them understanding that intimacy wasn't about grand gestures, but about the willingness to be present without performing. Chapter 8. The Resistance. The morning after Mary's confession, she woke to find Kevin gone, and panic seized her chest with familiar claws. This was it, she thought, the moment where he revealed that patience had limits, that vulnerability was weakness to be exploited, that everything had been leading to this abandonment now that she'd admitted she cared. Then she smelled coffee. Kevin emerged from her kitchen carrying 2 mugs. Fully dressed, his expression relaxed in a way that suggested he'd been awake for a while and hadn't spent that time plotting his escape. "Morning. I didn't know how you take your coffee, so I made it the way I drink mine and figured you could adjust." Mary sat up, her hair a disaster and her defenses completely offline, staring at this man who'd stayed instead of fleeing, who'd made coffee instead of making excuses. "You're still here. Where else would I be?" Kevin sat beside her, handing her the mug. "Did you think I'd sneak out while you were sleeping? That's a move for people who regret their decisions." "I don't regret last night. We didn't even do anything," Mary pointed out, taking the coffee and discovering he'd somehow made it exactly how she liked it, despite claiming ignorance. "We did everything important," Kevin corrected. "You trusted me enough to admit you were scared." "That's not nothing, Mary, that's everything." Over the following months, their relationship developed with the kind of organic growth that comes when 2 people stop performing roles and start building something real. Kevin introduced her to his mother, a formidable woman who'd cleaned houses to put him through college, and who assessed Mary with the sharp eyes of someone who'd learned to see through pretense. "My son says you're brilliant," Kevin's mother said during their first dinner together, her voice carrying the faint musicality of Southern roots. "But I don't care about brilliant. I care about kind." "Are you kind?" Mary had considered the question seriously because Kevin's mother deserved honesty more than performance. I'm trying to be, I wasn't always. The woman I was during my first marriage, she was kind to the point of erasure. Let her husband take credit for her work because she thought supporting him mattered more than claiming credit for herself. The woman I am now is learning to be kind without being invisible. It's harder than it sounds. Kevin's mother had nodded, satisfied. Good. Kindness that erases you isn't kindness, it's cowardice. My son needs a woman who knows her worth. Sounds like you're learning yours. The approval had meant more to Mary than it should have. Validation from a woman who'd raised a son to be genuinely decent in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Kevin's mother became an unexpected ally, someone who understood the work required to build yourself up after the world tried to keep you small. But despite the progress, despite Kevin's consistency and her growing trust, Mary still found herself pulling back at unexpected moments, testing him in ways she hated herself for but couldn't seem to stop. When Bruce's bankruptcy finalization was reported in business journals, complete with details about his total financial collapse, Mary waited for Kevin to say something about it, to make a comment about Bruce getting what he deserved, or to express satisfaction at her ex-husband's ruin. Kevin said nothing, just squeezed her hand when she mentioned seeing the article, a gesture that acknowledged the news, without demanding she process it in any particular way. "Don't you want to say, 'I told you so'?" Mary asked, frustrated by his refusal to engage with her damaged ex-husband's ongoing destruction. "Bruce is completely ruined. Everything he built is gone. Don't you feel vindicated watching him suffer?" "Why would I?" Kevin looked genuinely confused. "Bruce Finch isn't my story. He's barely even part of yours anymore, except as the cautionary tale that taught you what not to accept. Feeling vindicated about his suffering would mean I'm still giving him power in our relationship, still treating him like he matters. He doesn't matter, Mary. You matter. This matters." He gestured between them. "Everything else is just noise from a life you don't live anymore." His perspective should have been comforting. Instead, it infuriated her because she wasn't ready to let Bruce be irrelevant, wasn't ready to stop using him as the measuring stick for all men's potential for betrayal. "You don't understand," she snapped, pulling her hand away. "You weren't the one who got stolen from, who spent years building something only to watch it get taken by someone who promised partnership. You don't get to decide when I'm done being angry about it." Kevin absorbed her anger without reflecting it back, without getting defensive or making her fear a weapon against her. "You're right. I don't get to decide that. But Mary, I'm not asking you to stop being angry. I'm asking you to stop making your anger the foundation of everything else in your life, including us. Bruce hurt you. That's true and valid and worth your rage. But if you build our entire relationship on the foundation of his betrayal, if every good thing I do gets measured against every bad thing he did, then he's still controlling your life, just from a different position." The accuracy of his assessment hit her like cold water, shocking and clarifying. She'd spent months rebuilding her empire, destroying Bruce's reputation, creating public consequences for his theft. But privately, she'd been letting him occupy space in her head rent-free, using his betrayal as the lens through which she viewed every new relationship, every moment of vulnerability, every possibility of happiness. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. The confession quieter than her anger had been. "Every time I start feeling secure with you, my brain reminds me that I felt secure with him too. That I trusted him, believed in partnership, built my life around the idea that we were team. And then he stole from me while planning his exit. And now I don't trust my own judgment about who deserves my trust." Kevin moved closer on the couch they'd been sharing, not crowding her but making himself available. "So let's rebuild your judgment through evidence rather than assumption. You thought Bruce was trustworthy because he said the right words, performed the right gestures, knew how to make you believe he valued you. But words and gestures are cheap, Mary. They're the easiest things to fake. What has evidence shown you about me?" "That you're consistent," she admitted. "That you do what you say you'll do. That you respect my boundaries even when they're inconvenient for you. That you've never taken credit for my ideas or tried to diminish my success or made me feel like I need to be smaller so you can feel bigger. And that's not nothing, Kevin said gently. That's months of data points, all supporting the same conclusion that I'm not Bruce. At some point, continued refusal to trust evidence over fear stops being caution and becomes self-sabotage. You're punishing yourself for Bruce's crimes, Mary. You're denying yourself happiness because he proved that happiness is vulnerable. But everything worth having is vulnerable. Your business is vulnerable to market shifts. Your health is vulnerable to illness. Your life is vulnerable to 1,000 random accidents. And yet, you still run your company, still take care of yourself, still build a future despite knowing nothing is guaranteed. Why is love the only vulnerability you're not willing to risk? Because love was what had destroyed her most completely, Mary wanted to say. Because building an empire from ruins was easier than rebuilding trust after betrayal. Because the wound Bruce had left wasn't just about theft, but about the realization that she'd spent years loving someone who'd never actually existed, except as a performance, designed to extract value from her. But before she could articulate any of that, Kevin spoke again, his voice carrying a resignation that scared her more than anger would have. I love you, Mary. I've loved you for months now, and I'll keep loving you even if you never fully trust it. But I can't compete with a ghost forever. At some point, you're going to have to decide whether you want to keep punishing yourself for Bruce's crimes, or whether you're ready to risk being happy with someone who's actually earned that trust. I'm not giving you an ultimatum. I'm just being honest that watching you sabotage something good because you're terrified of it being taken away eventually is breaking my heart. Not for me, but for you. Because you deserve better than spending the rest of your life afraid. He'd stood then, preparing to leave, not in anger, but in the specific weariness of someone who'd fought as hard as they could and recognized that the battle needed to be finished by someone else. Mary watched him gather his jacket, his keys, the small items he'd accumulated in her space over months of slow integration, and felt panic rise in her throat. Don't go, she said, the words escaping before pride could stop them. Kevin paused, turned back to look at her. I'm not leaving for good. I'm just giving you space to figure out what you actually want. Because right now it feels like you want to want this, but you're too scared to actually have it. And I can't fix that for you, Mary. Only you can decide if I'm worth the risk. He'd left her sitting on the couch in her glass penthouse, the city glittering below like promises made and broken and made again, and Mary understood that she'd reached the moment where theoretical healing had to become actual choice. Kevin had been patient beyond reason, had given her every piece of evidence that he was trustworthy, had loved her through her walls and her tests and her systematic attempts to find proof that he was secretly Bruce, wearing a better disguise. But at some point, as he'd said, continued refusal to trust evidence became self-sabotage. At some point, protecting yourself from potential pain meant guaranteeing actual pain by pushing away everyone who tried to get close. Mary sat in the silence Kevin had left behind, her penthouse suddenly feeling less like a fortress and more like a cage she'd built from her own fear, and understood that the choice before her was simple, even if the execution was terrifying. She could stay safe and alone, protected from betrayal but also isolated from love. Or she could risk trusting that not every man was Bruce Finch, that some people actually meant what they said, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the prerequisite for every kind of genuine connection. The choice should have been obvious. The fact that it felt impossible told her exactly how much damage Bruce had done, how thoroughly he'd convinced her that trust was foolishness and caution was wisdom. But Kevin wasn't asking for blind trust. He was asking her to trust the evidence she'd gathered over months of watching him be exactly who he claimed to be. He was asking her to believe in data rather than fear. And if there was one thing Mary Godwin understood, it was how to analyze data and draw accurate conclusions regardless of what emotion wanted her to believe. The data supported Kevin. The evidence was overwhelming. The only thing standing between her and happiness was her own refusal to accept that the past didn't have to determine the future. Mary picked up her phone, stared at Kevin's name for a long moment, then typed a message that felt like jumping off a cliff while hoping someone had set up a safety net she couldn't see. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. Come back, please." The response came within seconds. "On my way." And sitting in her penthouse waiting for him to return, Mary understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That healing wasn't about magically becoming undamaged, but about choosing to build something new from the wreckage of what was destroyed. She'd rebuilt her empire from ruins. Maybe she could rebuild her capacity for trust the same way, one small, terrifying decision at a time. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point. The crisis arrived not from Kevin's behavior, but from the news that Bruce Finch and Angela Clark had reconciled. Photographs spreading across social media, showing them together at some charity gala. Bruce's hand on her shoulder with casual possession. Angela's expression suggesting forgiveness or perhaps just strategic realignment, now that her father's anger had cooled. The caption mentioned that they were working through difficulties for the sake of their son, which was public relations speak for both too damaged by scandal to do better than each other. Bruce looked older in the photographs, worn in a way that suggested consequences had aged him faster than time. But he was smiling the same confident smile Mary remembered. Mary stared at the images on her phone while sitting in a coffee shop meeting with potential clients. Her professional smile frozen in place while her insides crystallized into something cold and sharp. She'd destroyed Bruce's company, taken everything he'd built, exposed his fraud to the entire industry. And yet here he was, rehabilitated enough for charity galas, forgiven enough by Angela's family to stand beside her in public, apparently building some version of a future, despite having stolen from everyone who trusted him. The unfairness of it consumed her. She'd done everything right after discovering his betrayal, and yet he got to rebuild, got to play happy family with the woman he'd cheated with, got to smile for cameras like a man who'd merely experienced a setback rather than earned his destruction. She cancelled the rest of her afternoon appointments, drove to her penthouse, and found herself pulling out boxes she'd stored away. The ones containing photographs and mementos from her marriage to Bruce. She spread them across her living room floor, looking at images of her younger self with Bruce, trying to find evidence in her own face that she'd known the truth and ignored it. Kevin arrived to find her surrounded by the archaeology of her failed marriage. Documents and photographs arranged in patterns that made sense only to someone trying to reverse engineer her own naivety. "Mary." His voice was gentle, concerned. "What's going on?" "He wins." Her voice was flat, empty. "Bruce destroys everything, steals from everyone, ruins lives and reputations, and he still gets to win. He gets Angela back, gets to play father to his son, gets to attend charity galas like he's a respectable member of society instead of a thief who should be shunned. Where's the justice in that?" Kevin surveyed the scattered remains of her marriage, then carefully navigated through them to sit beside her on the floor. "The justice is that you're free of him, that you have your company and your reputation and a future that doesn't include being stolen from. Bruce getting Angela back isn't winning, Mary. It's two people who deserve each other settling for what they can get." "You don't understand." Mary grabbed a photograph, thrust it at him. "Look at me in this picture. Look how happy I am. I was building an empire for him, sacrificing recognition so he could feel successful, believing that partnership meant making myself smaller. And he was already stealing from me, already planning to leave me. How am I supposed to trust my own judgment about anything when I was so completely wrong?" "You weren't wrong about everything," Kevin countered, his voice steady. "You were wrong about Bruce. One man, Mary. But that doesn't mean your judgment is permanently flawed, that everyone is secretly calculating how to use you. How do you know? She turned on him, weeks of accumulated fear crystallizing into accusation. How do you know you're not just better at hiding it than he was? That this patience, this respect isn't just a longer game? That eventually you won't reveal you've been waiting for the right moment to take what you want? Kevin looked at her for a long moment, his expression sad but not surprised. Is that what you really think? After everything, you genuinely believe I'm secretly Bruce wearing a better disguise? I don't know what I think anymore. Mary's voice broke. I thought I knew Bruce. Thought I understood him, trusted him, built my life around the belief that we were partners. And I was wrong about all of it. So how can I trust anything I think I know about you? You can't be sure, Kevin said quietly. That's the nature of trust, Mary. It requires faith in the absence of certainty. But you can look at evidence, at patterns. Bruce told you he valued you while stealing your work. I've spent months showing you through consistent behavior that I respect your intelligence, your success, your boundaries. Those aren't subtle differences. But what if I'm wrong again? The question came out small, vulnerable. What if I trust you and you destroy me the way he did? I barely survived Bruce's betrayal. I don't think I could survive another one. Loving you makes me vulnerable in ways that building an empire never did. It is terrifying, Kevin agreed. Love is the most dangerous thing we do because it requires vulnerability without guarantee. But Mary, refusing to love anyone because they might hurt you isn't safety. It's just a slower form of destruction. You're not protecting yourself. You're imprisoning yourself in fear that Bruce created. So what am I supposed to do? Mary demanded, tears finally breaking through the anger. Just decide to trust you despite every lesson Bruce taught me? Kevin stood then, walked to the windows overlooking Manhattan. I'm going to tell you something that might make you angrier, but you need to hear it. He turned back. I'm not Bruce. I've shown you through months of consistent behavior that I am not him. At this point, your refusal to trust that evidence isn't about me. It's about you being more comfortable with fear than with happiness. Because fear is what you know, Mary. Fear is familiar. But happiness requires faith in good outcomes. And Bruce destroyed your ability to believe good outcomes are possible. That's not fair, Mary protested. It's completely fair, Kevin said, his voice carrying finality. I love you. I have loved you through your walls and your tests and your systematic attempts to find proof that I'm secretly planning to betray you. But Mary, I cannot compete with your fear forever. I cannot spend the rest of our relationship proving I'm not someone I was never going to be. At some point, you have to decide that the evidence I've given you matters more than the trauma Bruce left behind. He moved toward the door. I need you to figure out what you want. Not what you're afraid of, but what you actually want from your life. If the answer is safety through isolation, then I'll respect that. But if the answer is that you want to build something real with me, that you're willing to trust the evidence over the fear, then I'll be waiting. But Mary, you have to choose. He left without waiting for her response. And Mary was alone in her penthouse, surrounded by the remains of her first marriage, facing the possible end of her second chance at love. Mary looked at the photographs scattered around her, at the young woman who'd believed partnership meant erasure, who'd built empires in shadows because asking for recognition felt too dangerous. That woman was dead. The woman who'd emerged from those ashes had reclaimed her empire, destroyed the man who'd stolen from her. But that woman was still imprisoned by Bruce's betrayal, still measuring every potential relationship against the worst thing that had ever happened to her, still letting one bad man determine the shape of her entire future. Kevin was right. She was more comfortable with fear than happiness, because fear required nothing from her except vigilance, while happiness required the terrifying vulnerability of believing good things could last. But sitting alone in her glass fortress, Mary understood something she'd been avoiding. Fear had never actually protected her. Fear hadn't stopped Bruce from stealing. Fear hadn't prevented his betrayal. Fear had simply made her smaller, quieter. And now fear was about to cost her the one person who'd loved her without asking her to diminish herself for his comfort. Mary grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she typed, "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to build something real with you. I'm ready to trust the evidence. Please come back." The response came within seconds. "Already on my way back. Never actually left the building. Was waiting in the lobby hoping you'd choose me over your fear." And in that moment, Mary understood that healing wasn't about magically becoming undamaged, but about choosing to build something new despite the damage. That trust wasn't blind faith, but a calculated risk based on evidence. That love required vulnerability, but vulnerability shared with the right person became strength rather than weakness. Kevin walked back through her door, and Mary stood to meet him, ready finally to stop protecting herself from potential future pain and start building actual present happiness. Chapter 10. The Reclamation. 3 years after the divorce, Mary stood in the conference room of Godwin Cooper International Headquarters, looking out at the city that had witnessed her destruction and rebuilding, and felt something she'd thought Bruce had permanently killed: contentment without caveat, happiness without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Kevin walked up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Ready for the board meeting?" "As ready as I'll ever be." She leaned back into him, into the safety of partnership that actually meant partnership rather than performance. They'd married quietly in London at her parents' home, exchanged vows they'd written themselves about honesty and equality and the daily choice to trust, and built a life that looked nothing like traditional marriage and everything like genuine collaboration. The board meeting was routine, reviewing quarterly reports that showed their combined empire had grown beyond what either of them could have built alone. After, as they gathered documents and prepared to leave, Mary's assistant knocked with an expression that suggested complication. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. "Bruce Finch. He's requesting a few minutes of your time." Mary felt Kevin tense beside her, felt her own body prepare for confrontation. But looking at her assistant's face, she saw not threat, but something closer to pity. "He looks rough, Miss Godwin. I don't think he's here to cause problems." "I'll be there," Kevin said immediately, but Mary shook her head. "I need to do this alone." She squeezed his hand. "Wait for me?" "Always." Bruce was waiting in the reception area, and Mary barely recognized him. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who'd learned that consequences were permanent. He wore a suit that had seen better days, his face lined with the specific exhaustion that came from losing everything you'd convinced yourself defined you. "Mary." He stood when she entered, hands awkward at his sides. "Thank you for seeing me. You have 5 minutes?" She remained standing, refusing to make this comfortable for either of them. "I wanted to apologize." The words came out rehearsed, like he'd practiced them for weeks. "For everything. The theft, the affair, the way I treated you like you were disposable. I was wrong about everything that mattered, and I've spent the past 3 years understanding exactly how wrong." Mary studied him. This man she'd once loved, once built her life around, once believed in, with the kind of faith that made betrayal devastating. She felt nothing looking at him now, except mild curiosity about why he thought his apology mattered. "Is that all?" she asked. "I wanted you to know that I'm sorry," Bruce continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "That if I could go back and change everything, I would. You were brilliant, and I was too insecure to acknowledge it. You built something real, and I stole it because I couldn't build anything of my own. You deserved better than what I gave you." "I know." Mary's voice was calm, factual. "I've always known I deserved better, Bruce. The question was never about my worth, it was about your inability to recognize it. And nothing you say now changes what you did then." "I know I can't fix it," Bruce said quickly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation or any kind of relationship. I just needed you to know that I understand what I destroyed, that I take full responsibility, that you were never the problem. I was. Mary looked at him, this broken man seeking absolution from the woman he'd tried to erase, and felt nothing but a distant kind of completion. She'd spent years wanting him to understand what he'd done, wanting him to feel the weight of his betrayal, wanting him to acknowledge her intelligence and worth. Now here he was, offering all of it, and she discovered that his understanding meant nothing because she'd stopped needing his validation when she'd reclaimed her own. "Your apology is noted," she said finally. "But Bruce, I stopped needing you to understand what you did about 2 years ago. I stopped caring whether you regretted your choices about 18 months ago. And I stopped thinking about you at all about a year ago. You coming here apologizing, taking responsibility, it's all meaningless to me now. Not because I'm angry, but because you're simply not relevant to my life anymore." Bruce's face crumpled, and Mary recognized that he'd been hoping for something from this conversation, some sign that he still mattered enough to her to warrant her anger or her forgiveness. Instead, he was confronted with something worse than hatred, complete indifference. "I see." He straightened, attempting dignity in defeat. "I'm happy for you then, for what you've built. You deserve all of it." "I know," Mary repeated, because she'd learned that accepting her own worth without requiring external validation was the truest form of power. "Goodbye, Bruce." She walked away from him without looking back, found Kevin waiting in her office as promised, and felt a completeness that had nothing to do with Bruce's apology and everything to do with recognizing that she'd built a life so full of genuine partnership and respect that her ex-husband's presence in it was irrelevant. "How did it go?" Kevin asked. "It didn't," Mary said, moving into his embrace. "He apologized, took responsibility, said all the things I used to want him to say. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, just complete indifference." Kevin smiled against her hair. "That's the best possible outcome. You've moved so far past him that his apology lands in empty space." The validation came weeks later when Forbes ran their annual list of most powerful business leaders, and Mary's name appeared in the top 50. The article mentioned almost parenthetically that she'd once been married to failed entrepreneur Bruce Finch, relegating him to a footnote in her biography, a cautionary tale about the cost of stealing from someone smarter than you. Her parents flew in from London to celebrate, her mother pulling her aside during the dinner Kevin had organized. "I'm proud of you," her mother said, eyes bright. "Not for the success, though that's wonderful, but for surviving the betrayal and building something better from the ruins. For learning to trust again, for choosing happiness over safety." "Kevin makes it easy," Mary admitted. "He's nothing like Bruce, nothing like what I thought men were capable of being." "Some men are worth the risk," her mother agreed. "Your father was one of them. Kevin is another. The trick is learning to tell the difference between men who diminish you and men who celebrate you." Later that night, alone in the penthouse with Kevin, Mary found herself thinking about the woman who'd stood in the rain years ago, watching her husband claim another woman's pregnancy. That woman had believed her worth was tied to being chosen, to sacrificing without voice, to supporting without recognition. "What are you thinking about?" Kevin asked, noticing her distraction. "About how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the door to the best version of yourself," Mary said slowly. "But only if you walk through the devastation instead of letting it define you forever. Bruce destroyed my first empire, but that destruction taught me to build the second one, louder, prouder, without apology. It taught me that partnership means equality, that love requires honesty, that silence is erasure rather than devotion." "You taught yourself those things," Kevin corrected. "Bruce just provided the painful lesson that made learning them necessary." They stood together at the windows overlooking Manhattan, two people who'd built separate empires and chosen to build a shared life, who'd learned through different betrayals that trust was evidence-based rather than faith-based, that love required vulnerability, but vulnerability with the right person became strength. Mary's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She opened it out of habit, then felt Kevin tense beside her as he read over her shoulder. It was from Angela Clark. "I know we've never spoken, but I wanted you to know that you were right about everything. Bruce is exactly who you said he was. Thank you for the warning. I didn't take seriously enough. I hope you're happy. You earned it." Mary deleted the message without responding because Angela's realization was too late and too irrelevant to warrant her energy. She tried to warn people about Bruce through her lawsuit, through the public exposure of his theft, through every piece of evidence she'd made available to anyone paying attention. Those who'd chosen to ignore that evidence had made their own choices and earned their own consequences. "She finally figured it out," Kevin observed. "Good for her," Mary said without inflection. "But her relationship with Bruce stopped being my concern the moment the divorce was finalized. Whatever lessons she's learning now are hers to process." Because that was the final piece of healing, recognizing that Bruce's continued existence, his ongoing relationships, his attempts at rehabilitation, none of it required her attention or her energy. He was simply a man who existed somewhere in the world, making his own choices and living with his own consequences, completely separate from the life she'd built without him. The truest revenge, Mary had discovered, wasn't making someone regret losing you. It was becoming someone who couldn't imagine ever having needed them at all, whose happiness was so complete and self-sustaining that their absence felt like relief rather than loss. She turned away from the windows, from the city lights and the distant thought of Bruce Finch existing somewhere in irrelevance, and focused instead on Kevin, on the partnership they'd built through honesty and patience, on the life they were creating from choice rather than obligation. "I'm happy," she told him, the words simple and true. "Really? Genuinely happy in ways I didn't think were possible after Bruce. Thank you for being patient while I learned how to trust again." "Thank you for being brave enough to let me stay," Kevin replied, pulling her close. "And for building an empire I get to share rather than steal." They kissed in the darkness of their shared space. Two people who'd learned that power revealed was power wielded, that love required vulnerability, that healing was choice rather than accident. Outside, Manhattan glittered with the dreams of people still learning lessons they'd already mastered, still building empires they'd already claimed, still discovering what Mary Godwin had learned through devastation and rebuilding, that the greatest power isn't destroying your enemies, or claiming your throne, or building empires that eclipse all others. The greatest power is becoming so complete in yourself that other people's opinions, betrayals, and continued existence simply stop mattering, because you've built something so genuine and so strong that nothing external can shake its foundation. And standing in her penthouse with Kevin's arms around her, and her empire secure, and her future bright with possibility, Mary understood that she'd finally achieved what Bruce's betrayal had accidentally taught her to pursue: a life where she was the empire, the throne and the queen, answering to no one but herself and the partner she'd chosen to rule beside. The end